The Union Army Balloon Corps was a branch of the Union Army during the American Civil War, established by presidential appointee Thaddeus S. Lowe. It was organized as a civilian operation, which employed a group of prominent American aeronauts and 7 specially built, gas-filled balloons to perform aerial reconnaissance on the Confederate States Army. Lowe was one of few veteran balloonists who was working on an attempt to make a transatlantic crossing by balloon. His efforts were interrupted by the onset of the Civil War, which broke out 1 week before one of his most important test flights. Subsequently, he offered his aviation expertise to the development of an air war mechanism through the use of aerostats for reconnaissance purposes. Lowe met with U.S. President Abraham Lincoln on June 11, 1861, and proposed a demonstration with his own balloon, the Enterprise, from the lawn of the Armory directly across the street from the White House. From a height of 500 feet he telegraphed a message to the president describing his view of the Washington, D.C. countryside. Eventually he was chosen over other candidates to be chief aeronaut of the newly formed Union Army Balloon Corps. The Balloon Corps, with a hand-selected team of expert aeronauts, served at Yorktown, Seven Pines, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and other major battles of the Potomac River and the Virginia Peninsula. The Balloon Corps served the Union Army from October 1861 until the summer of 1863, when it was disbanded following the resignation of Lowe. Selecting a chief aeronaut. The use of balloons as an air war mechanism was first recorded in France by the French Aerostatic Corps at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. U.S. President Abraham Lincoln became interested in an air war mechanism for reconnaissance purposes. This created a notion at the War Department and at the Treasury that some sort of balloon aviation unit need be established and headed by chief aeronaut. Several top American balloonists traveled to Washington in hopes of obtaining just such a position. However, there were no proposed details to the establishment of such a unit, or whether it would even be a military or civilian operation. Nor was there any set method to the process of selecting a chief aeronaut. Rather, it became a free-for-all in attempts to attract the attention of any officials in either the government or the military. In actuality, the use of balloons was left to the discretion of the commanding generals through a process of trial and error based on the best recommendations of the balloonists themselves. Of those seeking the position, only 2 were given actual opportunities to perform combat aerial reconnaissance: Professor Thaddeus Lowe and Mr. John Mountain. Thaddeus Lowe. Professor Thaddeus S. Lowe was one of the top American balloonists who sought the position of chief aeronaut for the Union Army. Also vying for the position were Professor John Wise, Professor John Mountain, and Ezra and James Allen. All these men were aeronauts of extraordinary qualification in aviation of the day. Among them, Lowe stood out as the most successful in balloon building and the closest to making a transatlantic flight. His scientific record was held in high regard among colleagues of the day, to include one Professor Joseph Henry of the Smithsonian Institution, who became his greatest benefactor. On Henry's and others' recommendations, Lowe was contacted by Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase, who invited him to Washington for an audience with Secretary of War Simon Cameron and the President. On the 11th of June 1861, Lowe was received by Lincoln and immediately offered to give the President a live demonstration with the balloon. On Saturday the 16th of June, with his own balloon, the Enterprise, Lowe ascended some 500 feet above the Columbian Armory with a telegraph key and operator, and a wire following a tether line to the White House across the street. From aloft he transmitted the message, "Balloon Enterprise, Washington, C. the 16th of June 1861, to President United States." This point of observation commands an area nearly 50 miles in diameter. The city with its girdle of encampments presents a superb scene. I have pleasure in sending you this first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station and in acknowledging indebtedness to your encouragement. for the opportunity of demonstrating the availability of the science of aeronautics in the service of the country. TSC. Lowe's first assignment was with the topographical engineers, where his balloon was used for aerial observations and map-making. Eventually he worked with Major General Irvin McDowell, who rode along with Lowe making preliminary observations over the battlefield at Bull Run. McDowell became impressed with Lowe and his balloon, and a good word reached the president, who personally introduced Lowe to Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. "General, this is my friend, Professor Lowe, who is organizing an aeronautics corps and who is to be its chief. I wish you would facilitate his work in every way." This introduction fairly well settled the selection of Lowe as chief aeronaut. The details of establishing the corps and its method of operation were left up to Lowe. The misunderstanding that the Balloon Corps would remain a civilian contract lasted its duration, and neither Lowe nor any of his men ever received commissions. John Wise was an early pioneer of American ballooning, born in 1808. Although he made great contributions to the then newborn science of aeronautics, he was more a showman than a scientist. His attempts at free flight in preparation for a transatlantic crossing were less than successful, and he did not receive the same type of financial support from the patrons of the sciences. Nor did he carry the overall scientific credibility of Lowe. Wise was, however, taken seriously enough by the topographical engineers to be asked to build a balloon. Mary Holing indicated that Captain Whipple of the topographical engineers told Lowe that Wise was preparing to bring up his own balloon, supposedly the Atlantic. Other accounts state that John LaMountain had taken possession of the Atlantic after a failed flight he made with Wise in 1859, and later placed the Atlantic with LaMountain at Fort Monroe. Lowe's report says that Captain Whipple indicated they had instructed Mr. Wise to construct a new balloon. He also proposed that Lowe pilot the new balloon. Professor Lowe was vehemently opposed to flying one of Wise's old-style balloons. The engineers waited the whole month of July for Wise to arrive on scene. By the 19th of July 1861, McDowell started calling for a balloon to be brought to the front at First Bull Run. As Wise was not to be found, Whipple sent Lowe out to inflate his balloon and prepare to set out for Falls Church. Mary Holing tells of the sudden appearance of John Wise, who demanded that Lowe stop his inflating of the Enterprise and let him inflate his balloon. Instead, Wise had legal papers upholding his purported authority. Although Wise's arrival on the scene was tardy, he did inflate his balloon and proceeded toward the battlefield. On the way, the balloon became caught in the brush and was permanently disabled. This ended Wise's bid for the position, and Lowe was at last unencumbered from taking up the task. Lowe describes the inflation incident in his official report less dramatically, saying that he was told by the gas plant supervisor to disconnect and let another balloon go first. Lowe did not name names, but it is not likely that it was anyone other than Wise. Lowe's report about a new balloon has to be considered over Holing's account of the Atlantic. John LaMountain, born in 1830, had accrued quite a reputation in the field of aeronautics. He had joined company with Wise at one time to help with the plans for a transatlantic flight. Their attempt failed miserably, wrecked their balloon, the Atlantic, and ended their partnership. LaMountain took possession of the balloon. LaMountain's contributions and successes were minimal. However, he did attract the attention of General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe. LaMountain operated at Fort Monroe for a while with the battered Atlantic and was actually accredited with having made the first effective wartime observations from an aerial position. He also obtained use of a balloon, the Saratoga, which he soon lost in a windstorm. LaMountain advocated free-flight balloon reconnaissance, whereas Lowe used captive or tethered flight, remaining always attached to a ground crew who could reel him in. Wise and LaMountain had been long-time detractors of Professor Lowe, but LaMountain maintained a vitriolic campaign against Lowe to discredit him and usurp his position as chief aeronaut. He used the arena of public opinion to revile Lowe, but as Gen. Butler was replaced at Fort Monroe, LeMountain was assigned to the Balloon Corps under Lowe's command. LeMountain continued his public derogation of Lowe as well as creating ill will among the other men in the Corps. Lowe lodged a formal complaint to Gen. George B. McClellan, and by February 1862 LeMountain was discharged from military service. Free flight versus captive flight. There were two methods of piloting balloons: free flight or captive. Free flight meant that the balloon was able to travel in any direction or distance for as long or as far as the pilot was able to fly it. Captive flight meant that the balloon was retained by a tether or series of tethers manned by ground crews. Free flight required that the pilot ascend and return by his own control. Captive flight used ground crews to assist in altitude control and speedy return to the exact starting point. Tethers also allowed for the stringing of telegraph wires back to the ground. Information gathered from balloon observation was relayed to the ground by various means of signaling. From high altitudes the telegraph was almost always necessary. At closer altitudes a series of prepared flag signals, hand signals, or even a megaphone could be used to communicate with the ground. At night either the telegraph or lamps could be used. In the later battles of Lowe's tenure, all reports and communications were ordered to be made orally by ascending and descending with the balloon. This is notable in Lowe's official report to the Secretary, where his usual transcriptions of messages were lacking. Free flight would almost always require the aeronaut to return and make a report. This would be an obvious detriment to timely reporting. LeMountain and Lowe had long argued over free flight and captive flight. In Lowe's first instance of demonstration at Bull Run, he made a free flight which caught him hovering over Union encampments who could not properly identify him. As a civilian he wore no uniform nor insignias. With each descent came the threat of being fired on, and to make each descent Lowe needed to release gas. In one instance Lowe was forced to land behind enemy lines and await being rescued overnight. After this incident he remained tethered to the ground, by which he could be reeled in at a moment's notice. Besides, his use of the telegraph from the balloon car required a wire be run along the tether. LeMountain, from his position at Fort Monroe, had the luxury of flying free. When he was enjoined with the Balloon Corps, he began insisting that his reconnaissance flights be made free. Lowe strictly instructed his men against free flight as a matter of policy and procedure. Eventually the two men agreed to a showdown in which LeMountain made one of his free flights. The flight was a success as a reconnaissance flight, with LeMountain being able to go where he would. But on his return he was threatened by Union troops who could not identify him. His balloon was shot down, and LeMountain was treated harshly until he was clearly identified. Lowe considered the incident an argument against free flight. LeMountain insisted that the flight was highly successful despite the unfortunate incident. The showdown did nothing to settle the argument, but Lowe's position as chief aeronaut allowed him to prevail. Building military balloons. Lowe believed that balloons used for military purposes had to be better constructed than the common balloons used by civilian aeronauts. They also required special handling and care for use on the battlefield. At first the balloons of the day were inflated at municipal coke gas supply stations and were towed inflated by ground crews to the field. Lowe recognized the need for the development of portable hydrogen gas generators, by which the balloons could be filled in the field. Lowe had to deal with administrative officers who usually held ranks lower than the major and had more interest in accounting than providing for a proper war effort. This caused delays in the funding of materials. Lowe was called out for another demonstration mission that would change the effective use of field artillery. On 24 September 1861, he was directed to position himself at Fort Corcoran, south of Washington, to ascend and overlook the Confederate encampments at Falls Church, Virginia, at a distance further south. A concealed Union artillery battery was remotely located at Camp Advance. Low was to give flag signal directions to the artillery who would fire blindly on Falls Church. Each signal would indicate adjustments to the left, to the right, long or short. Simultaneously, reports were telegraphed down to headquarters at the fort. With only a few corrections, the battery was soon landing rounds right on target. This was the precursor to the use of the artillery forward observer. The next day, Low received orders to build 4 proper balloons with hydrogen gas generators. Low went to work at his Philadelphia facility. He was given funding to order India silk and cotton cording he had proposed for their construction. Along with that came Low's undisclosed recipe for a varnish that would render the balloon envelopes leak-proof. The generators were built at the Washington Navy Yard by master joiners who fashioned a contraption of copper plumbing and tanks which, when filled with sulfuric acid and iron filings, would yield hydrogen gas. The generators were Low's own design and were considered a marvel of engineering. They were designed to be loaded into box crates that could easily fit on a standard buckboard. The generators took more time to build than the balloons and were not as readily available as the first balloon. By the 1st of October 1861, the first balloon, the Union, was ready for action. Though it lacked a portable gas generator, it was called into immediate service. It was gassed up in Washington and towed overnight to Lewinsville via chain bridge. The fully covered and trellis bridge required that the towing handlers crawl over the bridge beams and stringers to cross the upper Potomac River into Fairfax County. The balloon and crew arrived by daylight, exhausted from the 9-hour overnight ordeal, when a gale-force wind took the balloon away. It was later recovered, but not before Low, who was humiliated by the incident, went on a tirade about the delays in providing proper equipment. Low built 7 balloons, 6 of which were put into service. Each balloon was accompanied by 2 gas-generating sets. The smaller balloons were used in windier weather, or for quick, one-man, low-altitude ascents. They inflated quickly since they required less gas. They were Eagle, Constitution, Washington. The larger balloons were used for carrying more weight, such as a telegraph key set and an additional man as an operator. They could also ascend higher. They were Union, Intrepid, Excelsior, United States. The latter 2 balloons were held in storage in a Washington warehouse. Eventually the Excelsior was sent to Camp Low, a high-altitude observation point, as a backup balloon to the Intrepid during harsh winter weather, but the United States was never put into service. LeMountain made reference to these 2 balloons in his diatribes against Low as being hoarded by Low so he could buy them unused at the end of the war. Establishing the Corps. Initially, Low was offered $30 per day for each day his balloon was in use. Low offered to accept $10 gold per day if he were to be allowed to build more suitable balloons. He was also allowed to hire as many men as he needed for $3 currency per day. Low was able to enlist his father, Clovis Low, an accomplished balloonist, Captain Dickinson, a seafaring volunteer from his days of transatlantic attempts, the Allen brothers, who had lost their own balloon when they were vying for the top job. 2 men the Allen brothers recommended, Eben Seaver and J.B. Starkweather. William Paulin, an older Philadelphia colleague, German balloonist John Steiner, and Ebenezer Mason, Low's construction supervisor, who requested active duty. Low set up several locations for the balloons: Fort Monroe, Washington, D.C., Camp Low near Harper's Ferry, but always kept himself at the battlefront. He served General McClellan at Yorktown until the Confederates retreated toward Richmond. The heavily forested Virginia Peninsula forced him to take to the waterways. Balloon service was requested at more remote locations as well. Eben Seaver was assigned to take the Eagle to the Mississippi River to assist in battlefronts there. Mr. Starkweather was sent to Port Royal with the Washington just prior to the Peninsula Campaign. First aircraft carrier, the General Washington Parke Custis, a converted coal barge, had its deck cleared of all items that could entangle the ropes and nets of the balloons, and it was used as a river transport for the Corps. Lowe had 2 gas generators and a balloon loaded aboard and later reported, "I have the pleasure of reporting the complete success of the first balloon expedition by water ever attempted. I left the Navy Yard early Sunday morning, having on board competent assistant aeronauts, together with my new gas-generating apparatus, which Bow used for the first time. Worked admirably.